everyone, it's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. Linda Martin is my guest today. Linda was born into the Idaho Followers of Christ sect, leaving the church at age 16. According to a task force set up by Idaho Governor Butch Otter, it's estimated that the child mortality rate for the followers of Christ between 2002 and 2011 was 10 times that of Idaho as a whole. In 2013, Linda went public about the many religious medical neglect deaths of children in Idaho, and she continues to bring awareness to the religious medical neglect of children. Every year, children in Idaho die because of faith-based exemptions. With the late Rita Swan, Linda helped set up the website idahochildren.org, which has links to important articles and information about laws in the United States that allow religious exemptions to medical care for sick children. Welcome, Linda. I'm so glad you could join me for this important topic.
Thank you for having me.
I'm in Canada, and I'm sure that we also have some exemptions, medical exemptions based on religious faith. It just seems so ridiculous. Children are our most vulnerable population, and for parents to deny health care, medical care to their children based on religious beliefs is just mind-blowing to me. That figure in there, about 10 times that the rate of Idaho as a whole, is just shocking.
Yeah, it's pretty bad in Idaho. Actually, that's the worst in the nation as far as the deaths go for children on the faith-based medical neglect.
Okay, I wondered about that. Yeah, wow.
You know, and like I said, growing up in the faith, I guess you start realizing that people around you are dying at a very young age. You know, I remember when I was 4 or 5 years old, my mother holding me up and having me look in a coffin at a dead person and telling me how nice they looked.
Wow.
And, you know, you would go to church one day and your friends would be there. Maybe a week or two later, they were gone. You know, and you know, we'll start out with my mother because, you know, that's where everything with me started, was with her. I was what I call myself a duty child. In the followers, it's another one of these religions that they believe in having children for God. Okay, my mother was 17 when she had my brothers. They were twins. And she went to the elders of the church and asked them if she had fulfilled her duty to God by having twins, because it was multiple children. And they told her no, that she would have to have another pregnancy. It meant multiple pregnancies, not just children. So 6 years later, I was born. From the day I was born, my mother never missed a beat in telling me how much she didn't want me, how much she hated me, and how much she wanted my brothers, but not myself.
Oh, that's terrible.
So, you know, when you grow up with that kind, I guess I was always the outcast in my family. You know, never really accepted by hardly any of the members of my family except for my grandmother, which was my mother's mother. And my mother's mother was a midwife in the church. And so she delivered a lot of the babies. And I spent a lot of time with her. And over the years, I got the impression that she was grooming me to take her place as a midwife. because I was very young and staying with her, and she was coming and telling me what kind of complications these women had during birth and what she had to do to help them. And, it's just really things like this kind of stick in your mind as you're a kid. And I guess years later, when I left the church, my mom and I had a really bad fight, and she actually threw me on the bed and choked me till I passed out.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I told her that I wanted to get married and that I wanted to leave the house. And if she didn't sign for me to get married, I would make her life a living hell. So that was when I left. Over the years, I kind of just put everything behind me. I didn't really want to deal with the church stuff anymore. I was still associating with people that were in the church. I didn't have a good relationship with my mother, but we still spoke and everything. And it was about, let's see, it was 2013 when I decided to go public. And that was when I contacted Dan Tilkin in Portland and talked to him. And he told me he couldn't do a story on it unless we found some new deaths. So I looked online and I found 2 within 24 hours.
Wow. Wow. I have a question about when you left. The circumstances of your leaving are just horrendous, the abuse from your mother. Were you prepared at 16 when you left? What does a 16-year-old who's been raised in a sect know about life outside of that sect? Had you been schooled? Was there a religious school or a home school? Did you know anybody that you could turn to?
I went to public school, but when I left, my dad told me, he says, "You're a married woman now, and it's up to your husband's family to take care of you."
So you were married then?
Yes, I got married at 16. And in my mind, my husband was supposed to he got his draft notice and he was supposed to be going into the military. So in the back of my mind, I was going to be a 16-year-old, which was considered an adult because I was married. I wasn't going to have a husband because he was going into the military, but I would get money from the military so I could take care of myself and continue going to school. Well, I was called into the counselor's office, and she told me since I was a married woman that they did not want me going to school anymore because I would be a bad influence on the younger girls.
Oh my gosh.
So then I quit school. And then my husband at that time was declared 4F, but not fit for military. So I was stuck being married. And a year later, I had my son. So I was 17, almost 18 when I had my son. And so I was a mother.
Were you guys still attending the same church, or did he also want to leave?
I left the church. When I left the home, I left the church. I didn't want anything to do with it. From a very young age, I remember looking around at all the women in the church and thinking to myself, I cannot grow up to be like these people. I want out of here.
Mm-hmm.
My dad wasn't in the church, but he told me when you turn 14, you can leave the church if you want to. You don't have to go anymore. Well, that didn't happen because my mother still forced me to go.
Wow. So you met someone, the fellow that you married, was he from the congregation or he was an outsider altogether?
He was actually Mormon.
He was Mormon. Okay.
So out of the frying pan into the fire.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And then you weren't allowed to continue with school because you were married. There's just multiple failures. It's so sad. People who could have and should have been protecting you and trying to help you. So then you're not in school, you're married, and you have your first child.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And then what?
Oh, well, ended up in an abusive marriage. You leave abuse at home, so that's what what you're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. So I was married to him for less than 10 years and got a divorce. And so then I was out on my own. with a child, nothing but the clothes on our back.
Wow.
So, I got a job. Well, I didn't really get a job at that point in time because I was pregnant when I left.
Oh, dear.
And I ended up losing that baby at 7 months. So I was on welfare for a short time. And then once I had the baby, then I went back to work. And I'd always worked in nursing homes or hospitals. So, it wasn't too hard to find a job.
Okay, good.
And after that, then I went back and got my GED and started working at the hospital because I had to have a GED before they would start promoting me. So I went ahead and got that and started being promoted and everything. And then I decided I was in housekeeping, so I didn't really want to do that my entire life. So I went to barber school and got my license and started cutting hair. And over the years, I ended up with my own business.
Wow. It's impossible to keep you down. You just keep getting back up. That's really inspiring. Okay. So then you ended up having your own hair salon or barber salon.
Yes. Yes. I worked for myself for probably 25 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Enjoyed it thoroughly, liked working with people.
How did you navigate? You had a child, a son, I think you mentioned. Was he interacting with your mom, and with your family of origin? Were you still kind of in a nearby place in Idaho, or had you moved elsewhere?
I lived about 2 blocks away from my parents.
Oh, wow. That's pretty close. So you probably ran into them and did see them some.
My mother never came to my house. We had issues. My son was one of her favorite grandchildren. And so where she was so close, he would walk home from school, but he would stop by her place before coming home. And then she started manipulating him.
Mm-hmm.
So we had issues with that. So I told him he couldn't go to his grandmother's house anymore because, he would go over there and it's like, well, mom won't buy you this stuff. Mom can't afford it, but grandma will get it for you.
Oh, wow.
And so when he was 16, he actually moved to Oregon to live with his father. I felt it was best for him to live with his dad than it was that close to his grandmother because he was having a lot of issues.
Yeah. Yeah. So then he moved to be with his dad, and he hadn't been with his dad for a while, but you felt that was a safer bet than leaving him where he could be manipulated and groomed by his grandmother.
To a point. I had total custody of my son. His dad was not allowed to talk to him. He was not allowed to visit. So my son had not been around his dad for 11 years.
Yeah.
But then his dad started coming around. His dad got remarried and was a little bit more stable, I thought. And so my son went up and lived with him close to Portland. And then when he graduated high school, he moved out from his dad's place and started on his own.
And then you stayed in Idaho and ran your business for 25 years.
Pretty close. I worked for other people for a while, and then, I had my own shop in Boise for probably 10 years before we moved to Oregon. And we moved to Oregon because I bought a shop over here. And I was working by myself, so it was a lot better situation.
Okay.
And my husband had been laid off of his job at Micron. So then he got a job working for Sony over here. And really, we almost doubled our income just by moving to Oregon.
Oh, isn't that amazing? That's fantastic. So it was a very positive move for you, leaving Idaho and going to beautiful, beautiful Oregon.
Yeah, you couldn't pay me enough to go back to Idaho right now.
Yes. And then, so your son was a young adult. Had he stayed in Oregon after he graduated and moved up from his dad's?
Yeah, he still lives in Oregon. He lives probably about 30 miles away from me.
Nice. Okay. And so what's the time frame from moving to Oregon and then getting in touch with the reporter?
We moved to Oregon in 99,
Okay.
and I got a hold of the reporter in 2013.
Yeah. What changed for you inside or got you to the point where you felt like this is a story that needs exposure? People need to find out what is going on.
Well, back in 2008 to about 2011, Rita Swan was actually working on repealing the Religious Shield laws in Oregon. And I was following that quite closely. And, there's a lot that came to play in this because over the years, I had one brother that remained in the church. And my nephew, Stephen, was 2 years old when he passed away of untreated pneumonia.
Oh, dear.
He was born with spina bifida and Arnold-Chiari syndrome.
Oh.
And if you're familiar with the Arnold-Chiari syndrome, it's where the spinal cord is actually being pulled down into the spinal column, farther down in the spinal column. So actually the base of his brain was being pulled into his spinal column. And so he had no medical treatment, nothing for pain. The child had headaches constantly. And he was paralyzed from the waist down. And, my sister-in-law would say, well, he's not any different than the rest of the kids. But I have to be careful when I spank him because he has this blister on the bottom of his back. And I have to be careful not to pop that.
Oh, my gosh.
Well, the child's paralyzed from the waist down. And so he can't feel it anyway, so why bother?
Yeah.
And my brother was one, he always made fun of people who had disabilities.
Oh, no.
Learning disabilities, things like that. He would actually make fun of them. And so when Stephen was born and had the disability, he wouldn't allow my sister-in-law to put him in a wheelchair. Stephen actually, when he was on the floor, he would actually pull himself across the floor with his hands in the carpet. And that's how he got around.
Such cruelty.
But, he was really a happy kid. He always had a smile on his face.
Mm.
But my brother was married twice, and he had, 3 kids from one marriage and 3 from the other. And none of these children were allowed medical care. Now,
were the children going to school? Like, were there teachers that could have intervened who did not intervene?
Well, 3 of the children from his first wife actually moved up to Washington to be with their mother, and she did get them medical care over the years. My sister-in-law's 3 children never had medical care. Her and her husband were both in the church, and her husband died at a very young age and left her with the 3 kids. And then my brother remarried her, and they had 2 children. And they had Willie and Stephen. And Willie never got any medical care at all, and Stephen never received any. And it's like I had one aunt that lost 4 children. She had 3 that were stillborn, which they suspected it was probably the Rh negative factor, which caused them to be stillborn. The one child she had alive, Jerry, died when he was 10 years old from untreated diabetes.
Oh.
And my other aunt, it was my 9th birthday, and she went into labor at my birthday party and then had to go home. And she had a baby boy that night on my birthday. 9 days later, he died from untreated pneumonia. And my mom always told me that it was my fault that he died because I had been misbehaving, and so God was punishing me by taking him away.
Wow.
So then I grew up. So then I grew up thinking that, well, if somebody around me died that I cared for, it was my fault. I started looking to see what I had done wrong to cause it.
Mm.
And so you grow up with all of this going on around you. And then, like I said, I was 16 when I left, and after I got divorced, and I remarried, and we were married for 10 years, and I had my daughter. And like I said, I lost a son just before I got remarried.
Mhm.
And then, like I said, I had my daughter. She's 10 years younger than my son. But it took me a lot of years to really kind of get my head together. And I ended up divorcing my daughter's husband, or my daughter's dad,
Mhm.
sorry. And, there was really no animosity or anything there. It's just that we grew apart.
Mhm.
And I actually went to apply for a job. And this guy, it was to actually work with an audiologist. And he took me aside one day. He says, meet me over at this restaurant for breakfast. He says, I need to talk to you. And he said, come over and sit in my car with me. We're not going to go in for breakfast for a little bit. And he looked at me and he says, I don't know what your problem is, and I don't know how you grew up, but you're going to kill yourself if you don't get yourself together.
Wow.
And he actually ended up being a suicide prevention counselor, volunteer.
Wow.
And so he talked to me for several weeks, just trying to get me to get my head together. And after that, that's when I divorced my husband, because he told me, he says, you're not happy with what you're doing. And he said, you don't want to work for me. And he says, you need to figure out what you want to do and do it. And after about 6 weeks, he looked at me and he says, okay, so I'm giving your life back. Now what are you going to do with it? And that's when I went to barber school and got licensed. And, my daughter and I, we went through a lot of hard times.
Mhm.
But, it wasn't easy going to school and being a single parent.
Right. Wow. That was amazing. That fellow who you didn't even really know, but who cared enough when he saw that you were in a perpetual state of crisis, to actually say something to you and be an encouragement to you. That sounds like it was a massively important step on your journey.
Yeah, and when I was going to barber school, he actually had me cleaning his house and his office so I could make enough money to survive while I did. So, like I said, he was very important in my life.
Yes, for sure. And now I'm going to fast forward us a little bit to where you're in Oregon, and you were following the work that Rita was doing, because you obviously knew the community and understood exactly what was going on there. At what point had the government said, oh, okay, yeah, religious people, your children don't count. You don't have to get vaccines for them or anything. I mean, that just seems unconscionable.
Well, back in the 70s during the Nixon administration, you're familiar with Alderman and Ehrlichman? They
Go on.
in the Watergate crisis.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay. They were important in the Nixon administration. And at that point in time, they were Jehovah's Witnesses. And so they convinced Nixon to pass these religious shield laws. All 50 states were required to have some form of a religious shield law in order to receive money for their child protection agencies. So they were receiving money to protect the children that were actually being harmed by these laws that were forced on them. I think it was back in the 80s when Doug and Rita Swan started going state to state and getting these laws repealed.
Okay.
And she just passed away, I think, little over a year ago. And she was still doing this right up until the time she passed away.
Wow.
But I
She saved
remember,
many lives.
yes, I have a lot of respect for her. Like I said, we did a lot of talking over the years. But back when they were trying to pass these laws in Oregon, I actually contacted her and told her my story in an email. And she said, well, we're too busy with Oregon. We can't deal with Idaho now. That's too much. And she didn't think that I had given her my real name or anything. So, it was just kind of swept under the rug. And then 2011, my brother that didn't give his kids medical care ended up in a heart attack. And there was so much pressure built up in his heart that it tore a hole in his heart. And he ended up going into the hospital.
Oh, he did.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't find out until several days later. I called my dad on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day and asked him, well, how are things going? I always called my dad on the holidays and stuff. And he says, well, not very good. Your brother's in the hospital. And I said, okay. And I mentioned my other brother, that wasn't in the church. And he says, no, William. And I said, what? How did this come about?
Mm-hmm.
And so he told me, and it was like, I guess the doctors told him he was within an hour of dying if he had not gotten medical care. Okay, so this was 2011. And during this time, the doctors actually flew a specialist in from Seattle to repair the hole in his heart. And they went in through a cardiac cath to repair this hole. And this surgery had only been performed 3 times in the United States by this one doctor. My brother was the 3rd time. My brother was the only one that survived the longest out of this surgery. So in the meantime, he ends up on hospice care, which he ended up with massages and medical care, painkillers, everything that he denied his children all of these years.
Mm-hmm.
And during the time he was sick, before he passed away, his wife had a stroke. So she ends up in a rehabilitation hospital being cared for her stroke. And I'm sitting back looking at these people. It's like, okay, you let your child die. You denied all of your children medical care, but yet you will get this care for yourself. And it was 2013, and I was over in Boise, and I went and saw my brother. And him and I were alone. Everybody had left, just the 2 of us. And I said, okay, now we need to talk. And I said, you've gotten all of this medical care for yourself now, and you've seen what it can do for you. If you had it to do over again, would have you gotten medical care for Stephen before he died? And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he says, well, the elders were praying for Stephen and they were helping him. The elders prayed over me and it wasn't helping me. And I said, how did they help Stephen? He died. And he suffered the whole time he was sick. Well, that's just the way I feel about it.
Wow. So indoctrinated, so brainwashed.
Yeah, it was just, and when I left the house, I told him, I said, I will not come back and see you again before you're dead. And chances are I won't even go to your funeral. And I just left it at that. And I ended up going to his funeral because there was a big family issue that I had to take care of. Back to this not being accepted in the family. Before my brother died, there was funeral plots for my mom and dad, and for him and his wife, and my brother and his wife. Well, my brother decided he wanted to be buried in the Veterans Cemetery up on the hill. And so that was given to him free through the government. And so he had these 2 cemetery plots that he wasn't using. And he wanted to give them to somebody in the church that I particularly didn't care for. And so he told me, he says, if you want these cemetery plots, I'll give them to you. And I said, fine, I'll take them, which I have no issue, no plan on ever using them. Well, just before his funeral, I wasn't going to go to his funeral, but my brother called me and it's like, well, what in the hell are you doing with these cemetery plots? And I said, what do you mean? And he says, why did you get them? Of all people, why do you have them? And I said, well, they were offered to me. I didn't want them to go to somebody in the church, so I took them, hoping that somebody in the family later on might have a need. And him and my dad just totally threw a fit because I had them. They were just fuming. So I flew to Boise for my brother's funeral, and I went over and I signed the funeral plots over to my brother. And I said, it's pretty bad when your family doesn't even want you around when you're dead. And that kind of hit my brother pretty hard because we've actually talked and we're a little bit closer now than what we were before all of that.
Wow.
But it's just one thing after the other like that with these people. They're so full of hate. I mean, it's just, it's ridiculous.
Incredible. Wow. So then, I think you were incredibly brave to speak with your brother in the hospital and speak very plainly with him to tell him exactly to take him to task on how is it you're getting this care that you denied your own children, and then to hear him say still that he thinks what he did was the right thing. It just seems so mind-blowing. And so was it after that you were in contact with Rita?
Not yet.
Okay.
But it was at my brother's house when I had a talk with him. He was out of the hospital then. And that was in 2013, just before, 2012, I think it was, just before, he got really bad and passed away. When I went to my brother's funeral, that's when everything finally, I guess when I opened my eyes to everything. Because when I went to his funeral, it was all these church people standing around there, and I'm looking at them, and it's like, okay, this person let, their child die. I was looking around at all these people that let their children die. And it's like, okay, they've got eyeglasses on, that's medical care. They go to dentist, that's medical care. And, you see people, it's just like one of my uncles was there. And this was the one that they lost their 4 children. Well, when Jerry was sick, or right after, he went in and had gallbladder and appendix surgery. And so I got to thinking, and that after my brother's funeral in 2013, I was asking people, well, why was it okay for him to go in and have this gallbladder and appendix surgery and then let Jerry die? Well, he was never baptized in the church, so he wasn't a member, so it was okay for him.
Wow.
And it's like, seriously? And I got looking at all these people, and it's like, why am I protecting them? Mm-hmm. Why is somebody not speaking out?
Yes.
And 2013, October, my birth month, I got a hold of Dan Tilken. That was my present to myself that year.
He's a reporter.
What was that?
He's a reporter?
Yes.
Dan?
Yes.
Okay.
Dan has actually been reporting, well, he just recently retired. And he had a 30-year career over here. And almost the entire 30 years, he was reporting on the followers and the children's deaths.
Wow.
I worked with Dan on several stories, and he's a friend. He got to be a friend.
Nice. Mhm.
So anyway, I found the 2 deaths that he needed. And so he got the coroner's reports and everything on those. And then the station he was working for then was K2, it was KATU. And he actually went to Idaho and went to the cemetery where all of these children were buried. And he started sending me all of these pictures of the graves and the names and everything. And so we actually came up, I think, with 11 more children that had recently died and got their coroner's reports and everything. And it was just the coroner's reports, when you read them, they're just horrendous. And so we went ahead and he did this story in November, I think about the first or the middle of November, and it aired over here in Portland. And then Boise stations picked it up the end of November. So that's what started everything.
Wow. And so you had spoken with Rita, and she said she was too busy with everything they were trying to do in Oregon to be looking into Idaho. So with Dan, you were able to kind of start shedding light on what was going on in Idaho.
Well, when Dan and I were working on the story, there was Cameron Stout has a book that's called In the Name of God. And that book came out just before Dan's story broke. And there was a book signing up at Powell's in Portland. And so I went up to the book signing. And Rita was there because she was getting an award for her work in Oregon that night. And that's when I met her. And Dan pretty much introduced me to her that night. And she had been working with Dan for quite a few years on different stories and everything too. So he was kind of, this book signing was where everything finally started coming together.
Beautiful.
And so after the story broke in Boise, actually when it broke in Boise, I was in Texas speaking at a conference on religious maltreatment for children.
Oh, sure.
And so after that, when I got back to Oregon, one of the representatives, actually the story broke in Idaho, and then the governor said he was interested in it. He had a task force on children's deaths and stuff like this. So the task force started looking into it. And until then, they had not been tracking the religious deaths, religious motivated deaths of children until I brought this up. And from there, ended up one of the representatives, John Gannon, got a hold of me. That's in January when their session began, and wanted me to go over because he was going to get a bill going to try to change these laws over there. So I've never done anything like this before. And John Gannon actually did not know who he was talking to because my name had changed from being married.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to Boise and I met with him, it's like, I didn't know that you were involved in this.
Wow.
He was actually an attorney, and he had represented my ex-husband in a suit several years prior. So I got to know John a little bit. And he was just blown away because people that had known me for 50 years did not know what I grew up with. I never talked about it. I guess I was embarrassed and ashamed of my family. I didn't want anybody to know, how I was raised.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my husband now, we were married, we've been married for well over, 28 years now. And the night before Dan came to my house to interview me for the story, I told him, I said, "Oh, by the way, honey, reporters are going to be here tomorrow." And he looked at me and he says, "Now what the hell have you done?"
No. Oh dear. So it was news for him. He didn't know either.
He didn't know how I grew up.
Wow.
So the night before the story, I'm explaining to my husband, it's like, okay. And he says, okay, so why does it have to be you to do this? And I said, okay, why not me? I said, if you could possibly save hundreds of children from dying, wouldn't you do it? And like he says, well, you got to go for it.
Wow. Okay, nice. So you've got his support in this very important and exhausting, emotionally exhausting work.
Oh, yeah, because, like I said, for 10 years, actually for 9 years, up until COVID, I was going back and forth between Idaho all the time. I actually was part of 3 documentaries. There was one that never saw the light of day. That's one I wish we could have. There was 3 of us. There was my nephew and myself and one of my cousins, the 3 of us. It's the only time we've ever talked candidly and openly about the church and everything. And it was an awesome documentary. But the guy that owned it or wanted to do this documentary, he looked at it and he said it was too intense. Nobody would watch it. So he scrapped the project. And then there was the one that was fun was the equivalent to 60 Minutes, but in French. They flew over from France to do an hour-long documentary with us.
Wow.
That was fun. I've got a copy of that, but I don't speak French, so I don't even understand what I'm saying.
Oh, no. You have to get it translated. Did you end up having more interaction with Rita then? Of course, after you were formally introduced at the book signing event, I think you mentioned, had Rita been working across the United States to try and get the Shield laws repealed? Was she successful in some places then?
There were some states that they did make changes, and other states, but a lot of the states have some of the shields in. They're not as bad as Idaho. Idaho is one of the few that actually has a religious exemption for felony child neglect and manslaughter. And they even have the codes in their civil codes, to where my understanding is that if there's a divorce and one is the faith healer and the other one's not, the one that doesn't believe in medicine does not have to pay for medical care or anything for their children. And the laws in Idaho only pertain to children. Like if a husband denies his spouse medical care, he can actually be prosecuted. Or a woman with, if one spouse withholds medical from the other, they can be prosecuted in Idaho. But they can't be if it's children.
That's just hard for me to even wrap my mind around. It's so horrible. And of course, it doesn't only affect children from the particular sect that you were raised in, but I'm also thinking of children born to Jehovah's Witness parents who will refuse blood products if needed. And then, of course, children raised in Christian Science homes. We know that there are still Christian scientists out there. Their numbers are definitely diminishing, but they also, I think, would likely reject medical care.
Christian Scientists actually, it's one of the few religions they have, I believe, a lobbyist in every state. And their lobbyist in Idaho said they would not oppose the bill. That if we got a bill going forward, they would not try to stop it.
Okay.
They did not try to stop it in Oregon. They said that there was like 86 deaths that were reported in one cemetery in Oregon. And they said that it was, I guess, so extreme that they wouldn't even oppose it. Now, the difference in Idaho is the Peaceful Valley Cemetery. There's a little over 600 burials there. Over 200 of those are children. If I'm getting my numbers correct, like I said, I think there's about 600 burials, and like I said, well over 200 are children.
Wow. And in Oregon, were those deaths largely attributed to the sect that you grew up in? Or were they from different religious groups where parents were denying their children medical care?
Most of them were the followers of Christ that I grew up in, but there's another one that's called the First Assembly Church, Church of the Firstborn. And actually, I'm related to them too. They share bloodlines with the followers. Their beliefs are almost identical. And I was always told that we had relatives in Oregon and everything, but these churches don't interact with each other. We were told that these people were worldly and we shouldn't associate with them. I didn't know they were relatives of mine. My great-grandfather was an elder in the Oregon City Church. But I learned of the First Assembly Church of the Firstborn when there was a death in Oregon. And there was a trial over here for the parents because they let a 10-year-old girl die of diabetes.
Oh.
And I was actually meeting with a reporter at the trial for these parents. And when I got there, I started looking around the room and it's like, holy cow, I look like these people. I'm related to them.
Wow.
And I told the reporter, I said, don't talk to me until we're out of here later on today. And I went and sat down and the mother of the woman that was being prosecuted, or the couple, she came up to me and she says, what church are you from and who are you? And so I told her I'm not in the Church of the Firstborn, but I was in the Followers of Christ. And she says, oh, I can't remember if it was her husband or her dad was baptized in the church I went to.
Mm-hmm.
And she started telling me how we were all related, and come to find out the people that were being prosecuted were my relatives.
Wow.
And so I went to that trial and sat through it. And then they also had an appeal. It wasn't the Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeals heard their case, and I went to that also at the same time. So it was, like I said, I followed that one through from the beginning to the end.
And so have the laws in Oregon been repealed then so that children are safer?
The laws in Oregon were repealed in 2011. And since then, there's been very few deaths. There have been a few, but the parents have been prosecuted. So
Okay.
I know one of the last deaths, there's actually an ongoing case now. There was 2 ongoing cases, one where the parents refused medical care for the one boy, but they ended up, he survived, and so they got him medical care with the court order. And so that one is pretty much, they're on probation with that. But the baby that died, that one is going to be months before I don't know if they're going to bring charges or, what'll happen on that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the other cases, the parents were actually charged with first-degree murder.
Wow.
And so they ended up doing a plea bargain on that one. And they had to write a notice and post it in the church that they were recommending all parents get medical care for their children when in need and things like this. And I think her and her husband were actually sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And her sister, I think, had just gotten out of prison for letting her child die.
Wow.
So there's some that are hardcore and they just think they're above the law, so they're going to test it.
Oh, and of course, then they will just talk about how persecuted they are for being Christians and for following whatever version of the Bible it's very, very frustrating. So have most states in the United States repealed the shield laws?
No, to some extent. I'm actually going through state by state now and looking at their religious shield laws. A lot of them have the religious shields, but they've written in there a clause on if it causes permanent disability or death. They've got a protection written in there. The problem is, if you're dealing with these faith healing churches, nobody outside of the family or the church sees that kid before they're so far gone or they're dead. So you have to prosecute. Prosecuting these people and the fear of going to prison is the only way to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the states that still have this provision in there for permanent disability or death, that's great, but there's several things that have to happen. First, you have to have a sick child that's reported. The second thing is it has to be reported to law enforcement and to a coroner. You have to have law enforcement that's willing to investigate, and you have to have a coroner that will investigate or do autopsies.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to have a prosecutor that's willing to prosecute these cases. In Idaho, the first thing is the kids are dead before anybody sees them. The second thing is, in some of these counties, well, in one county, especially where most of the deaths were happening in Idaho, the coroner at that time said that she determined the cause of death by interviewing the parents. And what the parents were telling her is what she was writing down on the death certificate. Okay. Until I brought up the laws in Idaho, that coroner was never turning these over to law enforcement to begin with. But in Idaho, it says if the death cannot be medically, if there's not a medical cause for it, if the child's not being seen by a doctor, and if it's an unattended death, it is to be turned over to law enforcement for an investigation. Until I brought all of this up in the news, the deaths over there in Canyon County in Idaho were not being investigated. There were times I don't think that coroner even went to the homes. You know, I've got death certificates and coroner's reports on children going back 100 years in Idaho. And I mean, you read these things, you know, it's just like we did the documentary No Greater Law, and it came out in 2018. It was nominated for an Emmy in 2018.
Wow.
Didn't win, and I hate the movie because, in my opinion, they made Dan Seavey, which is one of the followers, and he's lost 3 or 4 boys. And his last son died. The one boy died while we were filming that documentary. And in my opinion, they made a martyr out of him. I don't like the film.
Okay.
And his first 2 boys, it was on the coroner's report. The first one, it was like he died of pneumonia. You know, and it's like, well, he had been sick and blah, blah, blah. On the coroner's reports, they always put in where the child was found, you know, what the parents said, and, you know, information like that. The second child had the same cause of death. They didn't list where he was found in the house. They didn't list what clothing he was wearing. It was nothing. And so this coroner, basically, I don't think she even went to the house and saw this child. A lot of these babies, especially the stillborns, instead of checking to see if they were born alive and then died, were just sometimes just left with the parents and then turned over to a mortuary.
Oh my gosh.
And thankfully, we were able to get this coroner voted out of office. So now the deaths are being investigated. There's autopsies done on the children. And so you get a bigger picture of what's actually going on now.
Yes. So what are you doing? And is there any way that people can help or support the work that you're doing?
Basically, just it's being public with it. I've managed to keep this in the news and keep it going since 2013. That's my biggest weapon, is just public, people knowing what's going on in the public. And they've got to put pressure on their elected officials. Idaho is pretty much a lost cause right now because their politicians are very extreme.
Mm-hmm.
They're insane, basically. Just like this year, they were more interested in trying to pass a law on cannibalism and banning books than they are saving the lives of children.
Unbelievable.
They've banned abortions in the state. It's like I said, they're not pro-life at all. They say they're pro-life, but they're not.
Mm-hmm.
All of the politicians I've talked to over the years know these parents have the right to let their children die.
Oh my gosh.
So if a mother doesn't have the right to abort a non-viable fetus, how can these parents make the decision to let a living child die that could be saved by penicillin,
mm-hmm.
insulin,
mm-hmm.
Minor treatments? We're not talking cancer or anything else. There's a lot of children that can't be saved.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sorry, when you can give a child aspirin for pain to make their passing maybe a little bit easier, give them penicillin.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like one family over there that I know, one daughter died of food poisoning.
Oh.
Her older brother died of diabetes, while another brother has been on insulin since he was 8 or 9 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you treat one child and not 3 others?
Right. Yes. How can people find out about the laws in their state?
Pretty much just have to research. And on idahochildren.org, there's actually a list of the states and their laws by each state. It was back in 2016 that we put that list in there. Mm-hmm. But I'm going back through state by state, and I'm finding out that really that's pretty accurate even now.
Okay. idahochildren.org.
Yes. There's more information on there. There's information about the children, the pictures of the children, pictures of their headstones, where they're buried. All of this is on there. Most of the pictures and the information on the children is from me because I'm related to almost all of them.
Wow. You're doing work that is just, in some ways it feels like thankless work. It's horrifying that it even needs to be done, but I am so grateful and thankful to you for speaking out publicly, getting the news agencies involved so that they understand what's going on, to be a voice for the children who otherwise don't have a voice. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to tell us? Anything that you think is really important, or any advice? Just anything at all before we sign off.
I think what people need to understand more than anything else is they say, well, these laws don't affect us, but they do. Think about if your son or daughter, granddaughter, grandson marries a person that believes in faith healing. You cannot save your grandchild or great-grandchild if they're sick and that parent does not want to get medical care. So it could affect everybody. I have actually had calls from people in Idaho that, well, my daughter's divorcing this person and we're scared because her husband has visitation with this child and he doesn't believe in medicine and he doesn't have to give this child medicine if she's with him and gets sick. And it's like, well, I'm sorry. You have to, deal with the laws. And, it goes into court. And a lot of times these judges will rule in the favor of the faith healer.
Wow. That is such an important point. We might immediately think it can't affect us, but it certainly can, just in the way that you mentioned. So thank you very much. I'm hoping that you might address us at the conference on religious trauma soon to also share this information because it's so important. We do want it to be made public everywhere so that people can be taking action with the laws and politicians in their state. Thanks so much, Linda, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for asking.
Okay, thanks everyone for tuning in. If you are looking for help recovering from religious trauma, go to my website, divorcing-religion.com, and I hope I'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.